Hello. When we think of the Renaissance, we almost always associate it with Renaissance art. I'm guessing if you have an image for the Renaissance in your mind, it might be Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo or Raphael, the famous painters of the Renaissance. And there's a good reason for that, because it's in art that we see a new and distinctive style emerging. And so in this short lecture, I'd like to contrast Renaissance art with medieval art in order to understand what's new or distinct about the Renaissance. Art in the Middle Ages was almost entirely religious in nature. It was done with an intention to help the viewer turn his or her attention to God and to religious themes. It was intended to teach, to instruct. And so much of religious art in the Middle Ages is symbolic. It also tended to use bright colors, sharp lines, not much shading here. Here you see, and from a famous book of hours, a devotional book, various members of a noble family that are all sort of pasted into this cluttered composition, almost like a decal, flat images. And the artists were anonymous. We know the names of only a handful of painters or sculptors from the Middle Ages. The goal was not to show off the skill of the individual artist, but to draw the viewer's attention to God. So characteristics of art in the Middle Ages: religious, symbolic, bright colors, cluttered, anonymous. Let's look at how that contrasted with medieval art. Incidentally, the very word Renaissance was the creation of an art historian, a man named Giorgio Vasari, who in the early 16th century looked around him, realized he was living in an age of geniuses. He saw the work of Raphael and Da Vinci and Michelangelo, and he said, I'm living in the time of a rebirth, a renaissance of art that is has been the level has not been achieved since the classical era of the Greeks and the Romans. And he described the characteristics of that art. It included, among other things, a new focus on the individual. So this is not a type. This is not trying to teach you something. This is a portrait of a very specific individual. Here we see Pope Leo X. And this is probably exactly how Leo looked. Here we see Erasmus, the famous humanist, hard at work at a manuscript. So the idea of painting a portrait to depict not a type or not a characteristic like power, but a specific individual is a Renaissance feature. Vasari also noted that Renaissance art called forth a new relationship between the viewer and the painting. This is seen first place in the use of background to create a sense of depth. This is called linear perspective, in which the artist identified what's called a vanishing point and then created, by using a very careful method, a sense of proportion that brings in a notion of depth. Here you see linear perspective used to great effect to create this sense of three dimensions in the artwork. Another way of creating a sense of depth is called aerial perspective, in which artists used the backdrop of the painting to have a receding landscape, so you feel like you're being pulled into the painting by this receding landscape. Renaissance artists also were much more attentive to composition. They often designed things in clusters of three. Here's a painting by Michelangelo, in which you see this triad, which creates a sense of energy and dynamism. People are looking in different directions. The elbows form this, but it's very intentional and it's very balanced. There's an effort by the artist to get the viewer to look at certain things. There's also in Renaissance art a new interest in realism, both physical realism, here we have the decomposing body of Christ, but also psychological realism, the grief of the women who are grieving at the feet of Jesus. So an effort to paint things realistically. Here we see a painting of an old man who is done just as he looked. Finally, new themes, classical styles. Renaissance artists became interested in painting Greek and Roman mythology. Here we see a famous painting by Raphael in which Socrates and Aristotle, Plato and Aristotle are depicted, Da Vinci and